Arielle, are you snowed in right now?
Kind of are. It's wild. There's a lot of snow. We've hit like 20 inches of snow or
Oh my
something like
gosh.
that. Yeah, it's a lot. I was out playing and it was my kids today. Of course, they're home from school and they were, engaging of like the time-honored tradition of learning how to beat the crap out of your sibling in the snow.
I saw images of
Super fun.
people cross-country skiing through Central Park, and I thought, well, that's fun. We try and do like Olympic theme parties where we
Oh yeah.
do potato sack races, and you guys could just go out to the park.
Of course, we get a text message that there's no school and it's like womp womp.
What's the criteria for no school in New York?
The bar is pretty high right now. So today was officially a snow day as declared by the mayor. But when we got a big snowstorm about a month ago, that was a remote learning day.
Those are the worst.
Oh, yeah. I don't think anyone learns anything on those days.
Yeah.
It's just like more work for the parents for them to like not actually learn anything.
I learned that I could never be a teacher on those
Yeah.
days.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, let's dig in. Traditional etiquette says that politics, religion, and money should never be brought up in polite company. And we're here to discuss all three. I'm Debbee Hancock, a conservative and a Christian living in the Deep South.
I'm Arielle Goren, a born and raised New Yorker and a liberal Jew. We're asking the hard questions and actually listening to what the other has to say.
Is Anybody Listening podcast starts now. What are you paying attention to this week? Besides the forecast.
Besides the forecast, exactly. Well, let's talk tariffs because there was a big decision this week that we were both paying close attention to, especially after our tariffs episode a few months ago. And so, yeah, what'd you think about that, Deb?
Yes, I love a big decision day. So it's just like Christmas morning.
Or election day.
Yeah, or election day. I wasn't surprised by any means. I was relieved. I was surprised by the number of conservatives that were part of the dissent, but not a lot will change right now. It kind of has introduced more chaos. I'm watching to see what happens next in terms of the refunds. If that happens, I have a feeling they're going to make it very difficult to get those. And it'll be interesting to see how that works too, because I read somewhere that 90% of the tariffs were absorbed by consumers. So it kind of makes you wonder if companies get those dollars back, what will they do with them?
So I don't know if you saw J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, demanded a refund in the amount of like $1,098 or some, they did some math for every citizen of Illinois and like sent a demand letter to the White House saying that he
I'm sure they're really concerned about that.
I'm sure they are. Yeah. I was kind of like, I looked at that and I was like, it's one way to do business.
Yeah.
But I can't imagine you're going to make much headway with this White House that way.
Yeah, I wouldn't go spending those dollars yet. You're probably never going to see them.
Yeah, it was definitely a big day. It was, again, I think not a huge surprise, but perhaps a little bit of surprise to see Amy Coney Barrett and Roberts take kind of a really hard stand on it as they did. We'll see, as you said, we'll see what happens.
Well, I think what will be really interesting to watch is what happens this summer, because as you know, Trump slapped on some new tariffs under a new statute, and those expire in 150 days, which will be shortly before the midterms. I don't think Congress will do anything with that, but he's certainly not backing down and just taking no for an answer.
And the markets are reacting, right? So we'll see what that does to his strategy, if there is one there.
For sure. What else you got?
So I was really interested in a New York Times opinion piece I read earlier today. The title is Blue Cities and States Are in Trouble. Democrats Need to Change How They Govern. And it's written by two academics. And really the hypothesis here is that we need to be engaging in pretty large-scale pension reform, right? That this is a massive budget item that typically blue cities are very generous to their public officials, like their city employees, their teachers, their police officers, their other public employees. And this caught my eye for a number of reasons, right? This is not a popular thing to do for any politician. And it is actually something that my former boss, when I worked in the city of LA, Antonio Villaraigosa, did in about 2011, 2012, if I'm not mistaken. Again, not popular thing to do, but it had to be done. We, I believe, raised the age of retirement there, increase pay-ins to pension funds, increase employee contributions, and change the pension structure for new employees moving forward, right? So it's never going to be retroactive. I think that would be almost impossible. But it was a move that saved the city of Los Angeles, I think, an estimated $400 million. And when you're looking at the kind of hole that New York City, for example, purportedly is going to be in the next budget year, that a lot of our cities are going to be in upcoming for a number of reasons, I think this is something that we just have to find a way to do. And it's going to make people unhappy, but, we have to figure out how we do this. And the opinion piece makes the point that, like, you don't do this, and then you're cutting services that are designed to help people who are homeless, that are designed to expand Medicaid, that all these things that are really there to help people. And if you are stuck in a hole, you can't do those things, right? So, budgets are always choices. But anyway, I thought you might have something to say about this one.
I do think we could do a episode series on democratic cities and states and what their budgets look like. As a Texan that was living in Texas when there was really mass exodus from California, it's
Hmm.
always interesting to me, particularly when companies that we worked for went public, how individuals who voted liberal and stuck true to that, then left and moved to Texas and bought property there to avoid those taxes.
Yeah. I mean, and that also plays into the big debate that's going on right now in California and
Yeah.
beyond about this billionaires tax, right?
Yep.
And it's very, very interesting stuff to me. And I have a hard time, I think, formulating necessarily a very strong or steadfast opinion on this, because on the one
Mm.
hand, I think that there is an argument that makes sense. I think there's an argument that especially makes sense when you're looking at the amount of money that somebody like Peter Thiel is spending each election year to try to get the people that he wants elected in office. Right. So, when you're spending like upwards of $30 million an election cycle on elections, the notion that you then cannot be taxed at 5% of your net worth as a one-time deal to actually help people in your state is kind of absurd to me. But, at the same time, there's the very real threat that people could leave, right? You're talking about a population of 200 billionaires. That's it, right? So even if like 50 of them up and leave, you're not going to get the revenue that you're promising citizens that they need to, vote for to do this thing. So it's very complicated. I don't know what I think about it, to be honest with you.
Something that I am paying attention to is a lawsuit right now against Meta. The lawsuit was filed by a 20-year-old who claims that she suffered harm using the platforms as a child. The companies knowingly and intentionally created these platforms to be addictive. It's not by any means groundbreaking information. State Attorney General several years ago launched an investigation and filed lawsuits, and the internal documents showed the employees at
Yeah.
Meta were trying to make it an addictive process, and they knew the harm. The lawsuit, though, will be interesting as to whether or not she is awarded money from the jury. I think people are comparing this to the tobacco cases
Right.
decades ago, that this could really put the tech companies in a completely different legal position. My opinion on this matter has shifted greatly in the past 15 years or so. I think early on, I thought, well, that's up to parents to ensure that their children are not on the platforms. And I still believe that is the case. I do think that if we're going to have laws, it might be wise, similar to cigarette or alcohol, that parents could be held accountable as well.
Yeah.
But I think what we're seeing right now is most of the people whose children are on these platforms, this is brand new technology to those. I've seen a big difference between people our age and even people a couple years older than us. We were raised through college on forward with these platforms. We know the harm, and people just a few years older, they didn't really
Yeah.
live on it the way we did, and they weren't aware of the impact. So I think this will be a really interesting case for many reasons.
Absolutely. So, a couple months back, we did an episode about the Israel Gaza conflict. And I gave a little bit of background on my cultural upbringing and how that sort of played into my political beliefs, in addition to our kind of policy discussion on what was going on in the Middle East. And now it's Debbie's turn in the hot seat. We're going to talk about Christianity. We're going to talk about how the Republican Party and Christianity have sort of been intertwined in the minds of a lot of people over the past several decades. We're going to talk about sort of this growing issue with Christian nationalism, particularly on the right. And I think it's going to be a really fascinating discussion. So thank you, Debbie, for willing to open up about this.
Yes, it was a lot more fun when you were in the hot seat and I got to ask you that question.
It's always fun to be the question asker. Well, okay. So to start, can you tell us a little bit about kind of how you grew up, your religious upbringing, what kind of church you were part of growing up, and what did practicing religion look like for you? And maybe how that shaped some of your early political beliefs.
Yeah, I don't know if you told me this or if I read it in a comment, but I think early on somebody asked, I want to know where she's from and really what her experience was like. Which, I think people are wondering, is she faking it? Is she, you know, one of those people that claims this, but they've really turned away from it? But no, I was raised in a small town 20 minutes outside of Austin, which is a really unique place to be from because my immediate town and my neighbors and my school was very rural,
Hmm.
but like I said, we were 20 minutes down the road from Austin. Keep Austin weird. And so I was by no means sheltered. I was very aware and exposed to people that looked and thought and acted very differently from me, which
Hmm.
I loved it. It was a really great place to grow up. My home was a very conservative Christian household, and most people probably haven't picked up on this, but in our introduction for our podcast, I say that I am a Christian and a conservative, and that was a very intentional separation, but I am being intentional when I say that I was raised in a conservative Christian home, conservative being the adjective to
The
Christianity.
modifier on
Yes,
Christianity. Yes.
yes. In my household, the Republican Party and the church always went hand in hand. My dad had a daily political commentary show it was very lighthearted
Really?
and funny, and I recently found the tapes and they're great, but I didn't really think about it at the time, but now I laugh because it aired on a Christian radio
Hmm.
station. It was not on a news station. We attended a variety of different churches, but most of my time was spent in non-denominational and Baptist churches. I also attended a Christian elementary school. And one of my first political memories was sitting in my third grade Spanish class. And I remember sitting at my desk and watching my Spanish teacher walk by and thinking, I cannot believe she is pro choice. That was just
How did you
my
know she was pro
I
choice?
don't know.
You
I'm
just,
sure it was talked about. I'm sure it was the talk of
they're
the
like, she's the
school.
one,
Yeah.
the
And
only one. Yeah.
yeah, and that just blew my mind. How can you be a Christian and be pro-choice?
That's really funny because I think growing up the way that I grew up, I sort of like it wasn't until I went to college that I like had this realization like how could you be a young woman and not be pro-choice? Like it was
Yeah.
literally like it like didn't the thought didn't even cross my mind, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Proverbial coastal elite, right? But wait, I want to pause for just a minute because I want you to go back and define a term for me that I think some
Mhm.
people might not be familiar with is when you say non-denominational church. What do you mean by that?
Gosh, I don't wanna butcher this, but there's a lot of denominations in the Protestant faith. There's Methodist and Presbyterian and Anglican and Baptist, and all of these denominations have some sort of a hierarchy typically. Baptist is a little different for the most part. They are kind of run by their own congregation, and while they might be a part of the Southern Baptist Convention, they really answer to themselves, where the
Hmm.
Presbyterian, the Methodist, there's a hierarchy. Non-denominational churches are completely independent,
I
and
see.
so I think a lot of times what that looks like is those mega churches.
You went right to what I was about to ask is when people think of like the rise of the mega church, that is
Correct.
typically a
Yes.
non-denominational church, right?
Yes. Yes.
Fabulous. Okay.
That's just a long-winded way, I think, of saying that what you assume or what your stereotypical evangelical Christian voter profile might be, that was my experience. And I I had mixed feelings growing up about the church and what I was being taught. The 90s Christian culture was a very weird time.
So that's interesting that you even bring that up because even to me, again, growing up the way I did in New York, which is, of course, like very multiculturally, very diverse, but probably not a place where there's a big church going population,
Mhm.
right? And
Yep.
certainly not a big non-denominational or Southern Baptist population,
Mhm.
right? I think it filtered even down to us, the Jonas Brothers and their purity rings, or like Britney Spears talking about how she was like waiting for marriage, right?
Mm.
And like all these
Yeah.
things were very much like part of the swirl that we grew up in.
Yeah, that's
And I
interesting.
think part of that too was just like how it affected teen culture in our
Yeah.
era, right? Which I think is so interesting. So tell me a little bit about how you like experienced that on your end of things.
Yeah. This isn't for everyone. I'm in a Bible study and well, kinda offhand mention, like, "Oh, when you went to the purity retreat," and they're like, "What are you talking about?" Or there was basically like a Christian haunted house, and it is the most appalling, horrible thing that I have ever experienced. And it makes us laugh now. It kind of gives us something to laugh about. I don't think that these people were necessarily ill-intended. I mean,
Sure.
the people that I was with, they were so loving, so kind. The church is a place where I was seen at a time that I would say I was pretty invisible, and so I love those people and the individuals, but they got it very wrong. And I think a lot of people will say, like, "We got it wrong. This
Yeah.
was weird." So all that to say, like, I remember sitting in the church pews and thinking, like, "I love Jesus and what the Bible has to say, but what the church is doing is pretty weird." But it's all I knew. I wasn't
Sure.
exposed to, and again, this wasn't across the board, but this was my experience. All that kind of shifted. I was going to school in Dallas. I remember leaving a church service and thinking, I am so exhausted because
Mm.
I was working so hard to do the right things or to avoid the things that I shouldn't be doing. And I would leave church, and instead of feeling refreshed, I left thinking, oh gosh, I'm still failing. And I think that was an important point in my life. Like, I was supposed to reach that point and be like, yes, this is not the point of Christianity. The point of Christianity is not to be perfect. It's to realize how imperfect we are and that we can't do this on our
Yeah.
own. And I was my junior year of college, started to have a lot of skepticism of this large mega church that I was attending, and seeing a lot of hypocrisy. And someone recommended that I read the book The Ragamuffin Gospel by Brennan Manning. I mean, just a short summary, it basically talks about God's love being unconditional. And he explains in this book that a ragamuffin is someone who is broken and in need of God's
Mm.
mercy. And it's not something we can accomplish on our own merit, which just kind of like blew my mind. Cause like I said, like my whole religious experience up to that point was working on my own self righteousness. I think this is something that I absorbed. I don't think that anyone that was in my church would say, yes, that's right, you should be doing those things. But the overemphasis on what you should and shouldn't do led me to believe that that is the most important thing. And that's what this is all about. So, kind of tying it back to politics, because this is not about my life story. What I was finding is these overly prescriptive churches, is what I'll call them, were also the ones that were preaching politics from the pulpit. And
Mm.
I love what my current pastor calls this. He says that it is a gospel plus. So you're preaching the gospel
Hmm.
of Jesus plus what we think you should, believe about different political issues. And it wasn't until I moved to DC, I started attending a church called Grace DC. And I don't know if you're familiar with Redeemer in New York City that was started by Tim Keller, but this church was a plant of that. And the congregation very much mirrored the general population in DC. It was young, it was highly political in terms of staffers. And so, no surprise, the pastor had to be pretty careful. He couldn't
Sure.
get away with the same sort of messages, but I don't think that
And would
was
you say that it was politically very mixed?
for sure.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is
Yeah.
super interesting too. I
Yeah.
mean, there's probably not a lot of places outside of DC where you would get that, right?
Yeah, and I think too, it's important to note that this church was in downtown DC.
Mhm.
And so I'm sure if you're out in the suburbs, you're
Yeah.
going to have a more conservative, but this was very much, it was a very diverse church in terms of ethnically. And so people from all over, the country were coming here. So I absolutely loved it, but it was there that I'll never forget. Again, you have these like moments that stand out. One was, when I was in high school and thinking this, like, Christianity thing is weird and these people are weird. But then I have this moment where I'm sitting in the pew and I remember the preacher talking about how regardless of what party you are a part of, there will be times where your politics will conflict with your faith. And in these moments, you'll have to make a choice. What are you going to choose to follow, your politics
Wow.
or your faith?
Yeah.
And it makes sense, right? Like, if we're not perfect, no man-made institution is perfect, like a political party. And if you find yourself unable to identify an area where your political party may not be matching up with your ideals, there's probably a good chance that you've elevated your politics to the place of religion. It was also in this church where I began to learn what it looked like to live out my faith. I would say Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. One of the ways this came about was our church had created vocation groups where we would meet with people in our field and discuss the section of our faith and our work and what that looks like. And so there was a group for financial folks, although it was probably pretty small.
Yeah, right.
I was in the communicators group, which I feel like whoever put this together maybe was not totally in tune with the fact that press secretaries and journalists aren't always friendly.
The best
And
friends. Yeah.
yeah, and you asked about, whether our community was mixed in terms of political backgrounds, but I remember there being you would know this person, a very well-known reporter who had written several unfavorable pieces about my boss at the time and sitting in this
Yeah.
room with that person. I really leaned into this because my current job, I was working under a communications director. Again, you would absolutely know who this person is. They were known for being very aggressive. And it was a real point of contention because it wasn't just watching them be aggressive, but I was being directed that I needed to be more aggressive.
Oh,
And
we
I
have all been
remember,
there.
yeah, like, here's the statement, send it to them. And this wasn't even a statement under my boss's name. It was just saying, like, say this off the record to this
Yep.
reporter. And I felt so uncomfortable with it. One, I mean, setting morality aside, I mean, we're trying to persuade these people to like us, to believe us, to trust us. So it seemed just a bad way to go about business.
Right. Maybe calling their cell phone at 6 a.m. isn't a good way to get them to like you. Like,
Did you have to do that?
I definitely remember a lot of like, well, did you try their cell phone? Well, did
Oh,
you try them at home?
yeah.
Did you try them at their desk?
No.
Did you try them again on
Yeah.
their cell phone?
Yeah. I'm like, they're not going to answer the phone, right? They have caller ID. Clearly, that was an older boss making that suggestion.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I was really worried about whether or not I could be successful in this role if I didn't play that game.
Mhm.
And I had a real watershed moment when I was sitting at my desk watching Tony Snow's funeral. And I remember George Bush's description of Tony's relationship with the media, and it was totally different than what had been modeled to me. He was talking about how he was respectful and cordial and friends with these reporters who, if you don't remember, were questioning his boss's intellect on the daily. And in return, he was respected. And I just realized, okay, if the highest ranking press secretary in the nation can get to where he is with this approach, then why can't I? And it really
Right.
emboldened me to do the same. And that's about my job, but collectively, all these moments and experiences were changing how I viewed how faith should really intersect in politics. And
It's also got to be a pretty wild experience, I would imagine, sitting in like a Bible study as a press secretary with like a reporter who's written something like really nasty about your boss and like talking about forgiveness. Like that's got
yeah,
to be like,
yeah.
like,
Or how we show God's light in our work. And looking back, like, I don't know if he said anything wrong. It was just like, it was not a friendly piece,
right,
There was
right.
just that elephant in the room, literally. But my view from what I was raised of Christians basically using politics to legislate their morality was kind of shifted where no, a Christian in politics, it doesn't matter if you're in politics or finance or whatever, your job is to be the salt and light. And I can't think of a better place to do that in politics where it is so dark and negative. So I think what has frustrated me is we're not seeing that. What we're seeing is Christian politicians and advocacy groups taking this approach that the end justifies the means. So we'll do whatever it takes to win or score political points because we believe that God is on our side on this issue. And I often think about the religious leaders who tried testing Jesus and weren't really interested, but they said, "What's the greatest commandment?" And Jesus responded, "It's to love the Lord your God with all your heart." And he then volunteered that the second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. I also think about the Bible and that if you're following Christ, it says that you will exhibit love, joy, peace, patience, kind, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And I was laughing when I was reading through all that because it's such a far cry from how anyone would describe today's political environment. And I was curious what percentage of Congress identifies as Christian, and it was 87%. And so clearly we're missing the mark. And I think it's really because we're focusing on legislating morality. And I think both sides are guilty of that, as opposed to approaching politics with the love that Christ showed.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think when you say legislating morality, and we've talked about this too, right? Privately, we said like we both just don't think that you can legislate morality, that you can legislate tolerance, right? Like these are not things that we can create. We can try to sort of create the preconditions for people to do the right thing, but it's not something you can really legislate. And I think that you're right. Like, well, we see that the inverse, right? Like the photo negative, I think on the other side of trying to legislate morality is trying to legislate tolerance, right? And like, you can't really do that either. It's curious. as you were saying, 87% of Congress identifies as Christian. And I think, at what point has it just become something that is sort of meaningless? I have to check this box because like it's become an identifier that means
Yeah.
something to someone, right? But that in terms of whatever someone's own personal faith is or relationship with God or relationship with Jesus, like it's not descriptive, right?
Yeah.
I want to talk about specifically the term Christian. And for a lot of people, it's kind of interchangeable at this point with evangelical. So I want to talk about that term and evangelical voters for a minute. Because I think even casual followers of US politics know that the Republican Party had the evangelical vote locked down now for a couple of decades.
Mhm.
And to people who have been following this kind of thing, who are students of history, there might be some awareness that this sort of critical shift of evangelical Americans as an important voting bloc and a sort of a right voting bloc really began in the Reagan era and with the moral majority and Ralph Reed. But there's actually been a 20% point rise in the share of white evangelical voters who self-ID as Republican in the past 10 years. So Pew data shows that 85% of white evangelicals are Republican or lean Republican, by far and away the biggest swing towards the GOP from any racial religious subset group. There's a lot of theories as to why, and a lot of people outside this community who, have their own ideas. But I want to hear from you about why do you think what has shifted in the past, decade or so, 15 years, that has caused such a dramatic swing?
At some point, if we have time, I'd like to hear what your guesses are, because I actually have no idea what you might say. But I believe this shift in voter behavior has really just followed the shift in the parties. You mentioned the moral majority, and there were certainly attempts to formally lobby and activate religious voters in the 80s. But the major shifts that you mentioned, it actually started in the late 90s and the early 20s. And I think we have Karl Rove to thank for that.
Mm,
He was really famously credited for tapping into the disengaged evangelical voters, but I think he was able to do that because of who the candidate was.
right.
Obviously, George Bush was not the first Christian to run for office, but the way he talked about his
No,
faith.
interestingly, Jimmy Carter was, right? The first born again president.
Oh, I was like,
Hmm.
first Christian.
No,
Okay.
no, not first, but first evangelical.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
The more you know.
The more you know. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and what was different about George Bush is the way he talked about his faith being deeply personal and in such a
Right.
public forum. And I think his presidency reflected his faith. If you were to ask me, I said what I don't think Christianity in politics should look like, but what I do think it should look like is a lot what George Bush did. He didn't do it in a performative way or a check the box, but he was known to be a compassionate conservative. He credits that his commitment to spreading democracy came from his belief that freedom was a God-given right. It's not something that you should get just because you were born in America. If you look at his PEPFAR initiative, which I think is the single most overlooked accomplishment, he
Yep.
saved over 26 million lives and prevented 8 million babies from developing HIV. And then if you read his book, Decision Points, I don't know if you've read it, I absolutely loved it, but he shared his conviction to befriend foreign leaders and just share his faith with them. And so at the same time that I think this was happening where the Republican Party was really engaging these evangelical voters, you see the Democratic Party had an equal but opposite move away from religion. In 2004, the Democratic Party's platform mentioned God 7 times. In 2008, it had 1 reference, and then in 2012, they actually tried to exclude any reference to God and Jerusalem in their party's platform. They eventually, after 3 votes on the convention floor, changed the platform, and then it was ushered in with boos. You might say, well, we had two Democratic presidents, but those 2
Yeah.
presidents were very vocal about
Very
their
vocal.
Christian faith.
Oh, as I was about to say, which is really interesting, right? Because it is kind of at odds with maybe where you see, as you said, the party platform and whatnot going. But Joe Biden certainly has always been
Mhm.
vocal about his Catholic faith, and Barack Obama as well. Was pretty open about changes in his faith and like how his faith developed through his young adulthood, and certainly had it all down in a book before he even ran for president. Well, like, is it open for everyone to interpret? Yeah, I think that it is really interesting that, despite those changes, right, at the very top, at the helm of
Mhm.
when we have been in control of the White House, is you've had people who've been very vocal about their faith. I think that's a really interesting point.
Yeah, and I think people wanna see themselves in who's in the White House. I think about my My grandpa, he was staunch Catholic. I mean, his favorite swear word was liberal Democrat, but I remember him telling me the only time I voted for a Democrat is when Kennedy ran because
Uh-huh.
he was a Catholic. And so it's interesting how just that one aspect can convince people to kind of overlook, a myriad of other issues because, like I said, they want to see themselves and their values reflected in their leaders. I would add that I don't think it's just the political party itself that has shifted. I'd say our nation's culture as a whole, and when you look to Hollywood or the music industry and just the secularization of that and how they have attached themselves to the Democratic Party, I think just like as a whole, Christians are watching this happen and they're telling themselves there isn't a home for me in the Democratic Party and they don't reflect my values. So that's my guess as to why that shift may have happened.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I wonder too if some of it is sort of the inevitability of more and more evangelical voters just becoming voters, right? So you're
Mm,
talking about a group that previously kind of felt disenfranchised, as you
yes.
mentioned, for many decades, that didn't feel that they necessarily had a candidate or a party to identify with. And then you've just seen kind of this tremendous growth in a Republican Party that is really, and we could have talk a lot about whether the current MAGA movement is actually aligned with any of these principles, and we will talk about that, but at least paying lip service, right, to a lot of these issues and saying we are pro life, we are at least skeptical of full kind of acceptance of in society of LGBTQ people. We are, all this, the whole sort of kit and caboodle of social issues, right? And so, I think that probably part of it is just those voters becoming voters, right? You're like, it's the growth of people who previously were maybe not part of, didn't have a political home, finding their political home, right? In the same way that we've seen, um, a whole cohort of young men become first-time voters to vote for Donald Trump. Not too indifferent from the way that we saw a number of Black and brown voters become first-time voters to vote for
Mhm.
Barack Obama, right? So, the identity politics issue is still very much a thing, whether or not we like it and whether or not we want to believe it. And I think, there's a lot of people who probably need to think about whether they think their own identity politics are okay, but they don't agree with it when other folks are doing it, right? I think that
Yeah.
there's sometimes an inability to kind of to see the hypocrisy there, right?
Yeah, I think it's a very motivating way to turn out a vote, right? Like
Yeah.
if you're telling a whole group of people your way of life and your belief system is under attack,
Yeah.
that's really gonna get people out to vote.
Absolutely. And we've
So that's
seen
a
it
good point.
time and time again, whether it's about, we're going to take your guns away, whether it's about,
Yep.
your children are being indoctrinated, right? It's
Yep.
it's the politics of fear. Okay. So back to actually, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the
Yeah.
social issues. I mean, whether it's abortion, whether it's, the last 2 years, so much focus on trans kids, sports, gender reaffirming surgery, all these things, massive, massive animating forces on the right. And I think as opposed to other issues that can also be seen through a very traditional Christian lens, right? Whether it's feeding the hungry, clothing the poor, welcoming the stranger, all of the, kind of actually biblical things, right? These have been the focus, right? So like what do you think about that? Is there legitimacy to focusing on the social issues and using that as kind of a cudgel and turning out voters on the right who identify a certain way? I mean, obviously, we've seen it work, right? But um, knowing how you feel about sort of Christianity and public life and how it motivates you, both as a voter, but also just how you live your life, like, how does that make you feel?
Yeah, I'll answer this 2 ways. One is just commenting on why I think they're doing it, and then
Yeah.
I'll kinda go into what my belief system is and how it matches up with my politics. I think if you're asking why there's been so much focus on, like you said, abortion or trans kids, I think the media and Republican Party leadership focuses so heavily on these issues because, like I said a minute ago, it is a powerful motivator when you invoke fear and
Yeah.
anger and you tell someone that their way of life is threatened, right? Like if these people take over, then your kids are going to be indoctrinated or they're going to be exposed to this. And it leads to more votes and viewers and subscribers. But if you're asking, and I don't know if you are asking this, but this is how I'm going to answer it. If you're asking
You've been well
how
trained.
yeah. If you're asking how a Christian can vote for the Republican Party when the Bible contains, I looked it up, 2,000 verses addressing care for the poor, the answer for me is because I don't believe you have to choose between the 2.
Mhm.
I think there's my policy answer, which I'll give first, which is personally a lot of my opposition to expanding government programs is out of concern for caring for our nation's most vulnerable population. I am not opposed to the government assisting this population and helping them, particularly like women, children, the elderly, some of the most vulnerable. It's one of the reasons why I oppose expanding Medicaid through Obamacare is because I think it will hurt the people who need it the most. You can offer Medicaid coverage, but if the system is overcommitted and you can't get into a doctor because they're not accepting new Medicaid patients, then that's a real problem and it's not going to do any good. I think
So
also
you're worried about essentially the dilution
yes.
effect, right? And the idea that the people who need it the most are
Yeah.
not. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and I also looked up what percentage and this was a quick search, so don't come at me if I have this wrong, but what percentage of the American population is on some sort of safety net? And it said
Right.
30%. And I'm like, 30% of our nation is not the most vulnerable. That's a problem. Either it's a problem that 30% of our nation needs help, or we're helping a lot more than the most vulnerable. And then the other thing is we were just talking about state budgets, and the reason why these states are in the crisis that they are is because unlike the federal government, they actually have to adhere to a budget. And if they're forced to spend more on Medicaid, then it's going to take funding away from critical programs like education that will actually help get them out of poverty. And so, again, that's a little tangent of my small reason for why policy considerations that I think that conservative policies can actually help the poor. But I think the most common reason you don't see Christians feeling conflicted about supporting conservative fiscal policy is because it's not a question of whether or not to care for the poor, but it's a question of how should we go about it as
Mhm.
individuals or through the government. And I think one of the greatest misunderstandings is that a person who doesn't want to pay more in taxes is just simply greedy and selfish. I know quite a few Republicans who strongly dislike Donald Trump, but they still voted for him on the basis of his tax policies. And these same individuals have given, I know for a fact, hundreds of thousands of dollars to charities. And they spent weeks in developing nations to provide clean water or assistance with disaster relief. And it's really a belief that our dollars can go further and make a greater impact if we give directly to those in need instead of funneling it through the government. This is actually I disagree with some of Trump's surprise, surprise. I disagree with something he's done, but I disagree with a lot of his tax reforms for a number of reasons. But one that really rubs me the wrong way is increasing the standardized deduction because it really
Yeah.
takes away that incentive, or if nothing else, a reward to people that give a lot to charitable organizations. It really bothers me that somebody who gives $0 will be able to write off someone who gives $30,000. But kind of going back to the faith aspect of it, Christians are called to give personally and sacrificially and with a generous spirit. And I actually think a tax increase is a far easier way to care for the poor and, kind of pay your taxes and wash your hands of it. I think we're called to do more. And I've seen
Yeah.
this firsthand. A more personal approach really can make a greater impact. So in my church, we have a whole team of people called the Mercy Team, and they are dedicated basically to caring for the community and needs as they arise. So one of the things they do is they set up a weekly food pantry. And dozens of individuals at our church, they go and buy the food and they set it up, and then they're there when people in the community come to shop. And we could just give them a grocery gift card, but we've seen a huge impact by showing up at the pantry each week when they are shopping and building relationships with these single moms. We have immigrants. And while they shop at the food bank, we've been able to discover other needs that they may have. We've been
Sure.
helping people with their rent and their utilities. One lady, her son didn't have a job and he wanted to meet with mentors and help get job training. We found out that there was an immigrant family. We don't have a bus system in our school district, and this kid was having to ride his bike across not a great part of town. And there were individuals in our church who every single day for a year went out of their way, picked up this kid and took him to school. Our mercy team also has built relationship with the school counselors. When they learn about a kid or a family in need, they pick up the phone and they call someone in our church and say, this kid needs a bike, or this family needs a mattress or a washing machine. And we talked to Elizabeth Jordan about this a little bit last week when
Yeah.
she said when she first started off on the street, she learned that yes, these people have material needs, but their greatest need was relationships. And Mother Teresa spoke to this as well. She said the most terrible poverty is loneliness and the feeling of being unloved. And when we meet individuals on this more personal level, they haven't just secured that new material good or their groceries. They are now connected to a community of people who want to support them and encourage them. And they think, like, I'm not in this alone.
Yeah.
And so that's why I would rather give my money to my church, who then gives the money to the community. You know, when we give to our church, it's not simply to support the church building or the staff or whatever. The
Right.
majority of our money is going externally. But I love that you asked this question because it really has challenged me. Like, what other ways can I give up comfort? Like, how can I make this more sacrificial? Because I really believe that that's what we're called to do. With that said, I acknowledge that there are policies within the Republican platform that are incongruent with our faith. We talked at length about this during our conversation on the ICE raids.
Yeah.
I think same with our homeless conversation. Tim Keller, who was the pastor of New York City Redeemer Church before he passed away a few years ago, he said, and this is a few sentences, so bear with me, but I think it's so good. He said, I think each Christian will have to find his or her own tiebreaker among the various biblical concerns and then choose a candidate. But as we do that, we should not idolize one party or demonize the other. The two-party system does not serve Christians well. Currently, it virtually forces us to leave half of our faith at the door. Our spirit towards others in the party should be cordial, respectful, and humble. And I think that's the problem. We aren't given that choice. We are told that the Republican Party is the party of God. You know, it's one and the same, and it's created a system where it is really easy to call the other side the enemy, literally
Yep.
like a spiritual enemy, and that has contributed to a lot of the problems that we see right now.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack in what you just said. But the one thing in the interest of time that I really want to latch onto is that I hope that people who are listening will recognize, and thank you for the descriptions that you gave, like so vividly, of everything that your church has worked on through the Mercy Team, because that is so aligned with so much of the work that I know that many of my friends sort of in the like progressive community, whether it's through mutual aid, whether it's through their activism, it's so aligned with the work that they have done, just not in a church setting,
Yeah.
right? And so I think it's really important for both sides, right? People who are really rooted in their Christian faith, who are engaging this kind of work, people on your Mercy Team, Elizabeth Jordan, et cetera, to understand that everything that is being done in that realm, it's such a perfect kind of mirror to what so many of us are compelled to do because of our
Mhm.
liberal politics, right?
Yeah.
And it's just really a question of like the delivery mechanism, right?
Yeah.
And it's a question of how much and to what extent you personally, but I think we might all have slightly differing opinions on this, but how much you believe the government is responsible for that or not, right? Whether
Mhm.
in funding or directly or indirectly or whatever. But at the end of the day, we're all in the business of helping people. And so I think it's really important that everybody understand kind of on both sides of the aisle that like
Yeah.
we're all working towards this same goal.
Yeah. I love that. That's an excellent point.
Well, let's talk about President Trump. We try not to, I think, but we're talking about Christian voters. We're talking about, people who see themselves as values voters on the right. Um, this has been a real head scratcher for me. I think it's been a head scratcher for a lot of people, right? I guess, what can you say? What can you tell us about support for Trump specifically, how he came to be seen as a viable vehicle for enacting a Christian right agenda, despite his many, many moral and very public failings? Again, it's been a real head scratcher, I think, to a lot of people on the left. It's been kind of like infuriating, right? It's like, how could this even happen? How could we get to this point where someone who says I could, shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and still be elected president,
Mhm.
right? It was just like, it's
Mhm.
like every commandment there is, right? Like what the most fundamental of them. So yeah, what do you want to say about that?
Yeah, well, he wasn't wrong.
It turns out, right?
I feel wholly inequipped to answer this question because I can't make sense of it myself, and I
Yeah.
think it's because it doesn't make sense. So I'm gonna purely speculate on this one. A lot of people try and say, "Oh, well, we're all flawed and God can forgive us
Mm,
all." I don't wanna hold somebody's past transgressions, if you will, against them. But
sure.
I think what is different about Donald Trump is he has not shown repentance or remorse for any of those things.
Ever.
And
There's
so
no apologies in Trump world,
yeah,
right? There's no, and
there's
it's
no apology, there's no really turning and acknowledging, like, "That was wrong, and I'm
right.
changed now." Forget about what he's done in the past, what he is doing today, and the words that he is speaking and the way he is treating people does not reflect the fruits of the Spirit that I listed earlier. The Bible says they will know us by our love, and if that's what we're going off of, well, honestly, nothing troubles me more than this.
Mm,
I don't care about my politics that much. If he wants to destroy the Republican Party, so be it. But what I have seen is an affront to our faith, especially in situations like the National Prayer Breakfast a
mm.
few weeks
Yeah.
ago, a mockery of our faith and idolatry and hypocrisy and, I mean, blasphemy. It is, as you can see, it's very upsetting to me, but I was trying to make sense of it. I have been trying to make sense of it, and I actually think I had a little bit of an aha moment when I thought about my earlier answer about fear and anger and how that has been stoked by leaders in our party and the media. And like I said, a lot of it is based on the fact that the Democrats are coming for our way of life. And if you think about it, in walks Donald Trump, which love or hate him, he is known to be a bulldog who will stand up to the elite. And it started to make a little bit of sense to me. Like, this isn't about his character or a shared faith. It is really about his willingness to stand up and fight for Christians
Right.
against the secular Democrats that are coming for their faith.
Right. Right. The idea of like he's an asshole, but he's our asshole, so it's okay.
Yeah, he's gonna fight for us.
Yeah.
And and I think even if that is true, I can't emphasize enough how wrong this is. Um, and that you're being manipulated and
Yeah.
used. And Kathy Keller, which ironically enough is also my mom's name, but she was I'm quoting a lot of Tim Keller, in this, and I always laugh because Presbyterians, I think, always overquote him, but he says a lot of good things about
Yeah.
politics, and he did a joint post with his wife, and in that post, she wrote, "Some who profess to be Christians act as if the time for kindness, gentleness, and the other fruits of the Spirit is over, and we need to fight fire with fire as they mock those with whom they disagree. Their view is that those with different political convictions are not just mistaken, but evil, and we have to be
Mm,
ruthless with those we oppose politically." Jesus heard this from his own disciples most of all, but also from many who understood that he was claiming to be the Messiah. When was he going to take power and overthrow the Roman oppressors? His mission, however, was not to seize political power, but through meekness and service to bring in the kingdom and remove the oppression of sin and judgment. And I just thought that was so poignant and spoke directly to those people that think the end justifies the means, that we have to be aggressive. We have to use these tactics because the left is coming for us. People on cable news, that the pastors that you see, I do want to emphasize that that is not the norm. I think
mm,
when you see these religious leaders cozying up, I think it is a power play. I want to be in a position of power, and I think that's why
right.
you're seeing that. But I don't think that's reflective of most faith leaders. But it does make me incredibly grateful for individuals like Beth Moore, who is arguably one of the most influential, prolific Bible study leaders, and Russell Moore, who's actually with the Southern Baptist Convention, that have dared to denounce Donald Trump's statements. In 2020, Beth tweeted, and I love this, it's so perfect. She said, "I do not believe these days are for mincing words. I'm 63 and a half years old, and I have never seen anything in the United States of America I have found more astonishingly seductive and dangerous to the saints of God than Trumpism. This
Hmm.
Christian nationalism is not of God. Move back from it." But it hasn't come without a cost. She left the Southern Baptist Convention. She parted ways with her publisher of several decades. People don't just now attack her politics, they now attack her legitimacy as a Bible leader. It kind of goes back to what I was taught at my church in DC, that at some point your faith and politics are going to be at odds and you're going to have to make a choice of what's more important. And fortunately, she made the choice to stand up and speak truth.
Yeah.
But I just want to, like, consider, let's say worst case scenario happens and our ability to practice religion is completely destroyed. I would rather live in a world where my way of life is threatened. Let's say you're in China or North Korea and you
Mm,
can't practice your faith, but the testimony of who Jesus is preserved. And that's really what we're sacrificing right now. Jesus said, "For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul?"
mhm.
And that's really what I think is happening right now. I think people are forfeiting their soul because they think that they're going to gain, I don't even know, like a world where the laws reflect all of their moral beliefs. I'm not really sure. But again, I'm very grateful for this question because to me, when people say it doesn't make sense that Christians are standing up with Trump, it makes me realize, okay, people still know what Christians should look like
Right.
and that this isn't the way. And I'm grateful that they at least haven't been able to damage Jesus's reputation.
Well, and I feel like it mirrors too what we talked about with that rabbi sermon that I shared with you that I was so moved by, where she said, "You can't worship God and also worship power."
Yes,
Those two ideas are fundamentally incompatible. You cannot worship
correct.
God and worship a tyrant.
Yeah.
And that's so aligned with what Beth Moore said there so
Mhm.
beautifully.
Yeah.
All right. So one last big question, which is I'm curious to know in your thoughts and sort of from where you sit, and I think I know the answer, but I think I do. But is there room in your world belief? Is there room for like a self-proclaimed Christian Democrat candidate who's making religion a part of their political persona, right? We've seen it done a little bit with a little bit of success, right? Like Senator Warner of Georgia comes to mind, obviously senior pastor at the extremely famous Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. And James Tallarico in your home state of Texas has gotten a lot of press lately, even more of late, given everything that happened with Colbert and the FCC censorship there. So obviously, I would love to know if as a Texan, you think he has any shot at all. If we want to horse race that one out. But how do you feel about people on the left sort of calling out and saying, like, I am a person of faith. This is what I believe. I think that this is like a misuse of religion of what we're seeing on the right. And do you think that there is a future for candidates like that on the left?
Yeah, I hope I haven't led people to believe that I am against injecting your faith in your politics. I think what I am very cautious about, or what has really upset me, is when politics come into your faith, if that makes
Hmm.
sense.
Yep.
And I am skeptical, whether they're on the right or the left, of anybody who uses their faith as part of their political persona. Can remember one particular ad a few years ago here in Alabama where somebody is sitting in a church sanctuary. And
Mm,
when I think about one of the commandments, thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain. And I think that is really what this verse means. I just get incredibly uncomfortable when I hear politicians using their faith to win votes.
mm,
When we marry our politics to our religion, and I think you touched on this early, it's really easy to confuse our political will with God's will. There's a reason Jesus taught us to pray, "Lord, your will be done on earth," because he knew that our will is quite often at odds with God's will. And so it's very alarming to me when I see someone conflate the two, particularly in an election outcome. I jokingly say I want to stay far away from those people during a lightning storm. I just think we should be
yeah.
really
Right.
careful before we attribute God's will to our desired outcome. I touched on this in the last question. I fear when we combine our faith and our politics, we risk alienating people from Christianity. And so whether that is saying the Republican Party is God's party, or if you say if you're a real Christian, then you should vote liberal because we're going to take care of the poor. Whenever you do that, if that individual disagrees with your politics, they're then going to want nothing to do with your faith. And I was reading a book recently where the author was explaining how he came to vote liberal, and his line of reasoning was he's a scientist, and he was saying, if Republicans are prone to rejecting scientific consensus, and I'm a scientist and I must be liberal, and
Mm,
I fear the same for faith. I just imagine an agnostic liberal turning on the news and seeing Christian leaders standing up front with Donald Trump and concluding that if the Republican Party is Christianity, then there's no place for me in that
right.
religion. And so I think overall politicians and their incredibly low approval rates make for really lousy brand ambassadors. And personally, they're the last people that I want representing my faith.
Fair, yeah.
From my viewpoint, the problem is not inserting your faith. The problem is really allowing politics to bleed into our faith.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. Well, what did I miss? What else do you want to share?
I think, the only thing you missed is what we're gonna be doing next, our next
Mm.
exciting little fun book club. You wanna talk about that?
Yes, I do. I do. I'm really excited. Coming up in the next month or so, we're going to be interviewing my former colleague and dear friend, Elliot Williams, who's the author of a really exciting new book called Five Bullets. It is about Bernie Getz, who, for those of you who did not grow up in 80s or 90s New York, was quite a character and someone who gained a lot of notoriety after he shot four unarmed teenagers, Black teenagers. He is still alive, a white man, on the New York City subway in 1984. This was a case that really, as you can imagine, captured kind of the imaginations of a lot of New Yorkers and beyond at a time when the city was really in crisis. It was very dangerous. And this really, I mean, so much of it goes back to everything that we were talking about in terms of the politics of fear and how a lot of politicians use that fear, right? So we're going to have a really robust discussion about all those issues when we talk to Elliot about the book, but we wanted to give you all a chance to pick it up, maybe even read it, or at least pick it up, take a look at it, thumb through it. Let us know what your questions are. We'd love to share your questions with Elliot when we have a chance to talk to him. It's a really fascinating book. Deb, I know you've dug into it as well, and we hope that it's going to be the launch of our bipartisan book club.
So on Instagram, we did a giveaway. We asked people to share our podcast with friends, and we each picked several books that were our favorites. And so we're going to be sharing those books, and we would love for everybody else to pick up those copies if you're interested. And we'll be talking about them through the next few months.
Exactly. As is the case with everything these days, a lot of people make assumptions about what you think based on what you're reading. And we think that that's a really dangerous place to be. And we both really enjoy reading a variety of ideas and opinions and reading and hearing from people who think differently than we do. We're really excited to bring you some books, whether they challenged our ideas or reinforced our ideas. There's something really, really great about having the shared experience of reading a book together, or at least discussing what we've read. A lot of us haven't done that since college or high school. So it's a really great experience. It's really humanizing. And we're excited to think some more about what this all kind of looks like and how you want to be a part of it. So drop us a line if you have ideas about that.
Yeah, I always say I don't understand the purpose of reading books that just confirm what I already believe. Like I already know what I
Yes.
believe. I find it so fascinating to read other people's recommendations and just get a glimpse into why they think the way they do.
Yep.
I'm really excited about Five Bullets for all you true crime lovers like myself. This is going to be a real fun one. So pick up a copy, and we're excited to talk about it in a few weeks.
Looking forward to it. Thank you, Debbie. Thanks for sharing.
Anytime.
I'll never make you my enemy. Can't get enough of your energy. Know that you're feeling the same way. Yeah, we live it up, I know for sure that I'll always be yours. We could be spending time chasing nights, cruise the one until we see the sunrise. Hit my line, we align. Every night with you's the time of my life.